So I guess I'll introduce myself. I haven't met most of y'all. I work out of our Memphis headquarters and oversee all of our ecosystem service, science, and ecological offset programs. So water quality, carbon sequestration, some of our ag sustainability programs as well. And I actually originally grew up not very far from here and have been with DU for about 4 years. My background is in natural resource management and modeling carbon cycling. So that's why I think Jake and the steering committee had me come join you guys today. Let's see, I don't know, I guess we just keep that at the bottom of the screen. And I will admit I misread the agenda. So I've only prepared about a 15 to 20-minute presentation, not 45 minutes, but I think that'll leave us a lot of time to ask and answer questions. I get the sense from the agenda that there's all varying levels of understanding of carbon markets in the room. So maybe just to start with, so I can calibrate myself, who is super familiar with the world of carbon offsets, whether it be forest or agricultural, any of those things?
Define super familiar.
Familiar enough to know what an offset is, maybe what additionality is, what a registry or project developer is. Okay, so I'm going to go through a lot of that terminology for the rest of you in the room. And then for those of you who are foresters, I'm going to ask your forgiveness for just totally glossing over a lot of details of forest management, but feel free to chime in. So I wanted to start with sort of a baseline understanding of why we might even be talking about this today. I don't think there's probably a single person in this room who hasn't seen a newspaper article about climate change, carbon offsets, and why we want to understand wetland and forest carbon and greenhouse gas cycling. There's things like the International Panel on Climate Change, the Paris Accord, y'all probably heard of various cap and trade schemes. California has a statewide registry cap and trade scheme that keeps essentially businesses from emitting a certain amount of carbon. And if they go over that allotment, they have to buy carbon offsets. Our nation, the EPA, is in charge of a national greenhouse gas inventory. And then probably the most common thing we're seeing in the newspaper now is a ton of public and private sector commitments to being climate neutral or reducing climate impact. So we just heard the NRCS talk about their the Climate Smart Commodities program, partnership program. And then for quite a while, there's been a voluntary carbon offset market that doesn't really have anything to do with anything legislative, but it's the way that a lot of companies in particular are beginning to think about their carbon footprint. So for those of you who were around in the conservation world in 2010, 2012, you probably remember there was a big buzz around carbon offsets with the Chicago Climate Exchange. This is just a little graph of kind of the history of the sale of carbon offsets. There was a pretty hard dip in those offset sales after the early 2010s. But we've seen a pretty remarkable uptick in 2020, 2021, and now moving into 2022. And that's really driven by some of the things I just discussed with you, which is like corporate commitments to these offsets, private and public companies wanting to reduce their climate impact by investing in reducing their own carbon footprint, and where they can't reduce, purchasing these offsets to replace some of the carbon they're emitting into the atmosphere. And this is sort of in the process of getting more strictly codified. The Securities and Exchange Commission will be coming up with rules that are actually supposed to, or were slated to be out in the first quarter of this year, that sort of make these goals much more quantitative. And this is because a lot of public companies are having requests from their shareholders to do this. So that's sort of the rationale for why these things are occurring. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to move away from that and sort of talk to you about the mechanics of how. So super very basic overview of carbon cycling in a forested ecosystem. So you have the live vegetation. For our purposes in carbon accounting, really in a forest, it's the woody biomass that we care about. The leaves and the understory vegetation tend to be ephemeral. So we won't think about them very much in the long-term carbon pool of a forest. Then we have the downed wood and larger material on the forest floor and things that eventually break down and accumulate in the soil pool. So when you're thinking of, at least in the context of long-term stocks of carbon that stick around a long time, we're thinking the live and the dead woody vegetation and the soil in the forest. Now, under forest protocols, there's also things that get harvested out of forest. And we know for long-lived products like timber, sometimes paper products and other wood products, those also stick around for a long time in the environment. And there's actually tons of data on the lifetime of each of those products. But when we think about carbon sequestered by a forest, in many of these contexts, some of those harvested wood products actually count as part of that sequestration because they're not going back to the atmosphere. So in a very rough sense, we can think of any carbon that a forest is pulling out of the atmosphere and keeping for a long time in woody biomass, whether it be live, dead, or wood products, as being kept out of the atmosphere. And that's sort of the overall, in 10,000 foot, really broad brush strokes view of carbon sequestration in forests, is things that we're keeping out of the atmosphere for quite a long period of time. And so I want to start with some real basic terminology so we're all on the same page and hopefully set the stage for more detailed discussions from the folks that are going to follow me. So we have this term I've already referred to, sequestration. So annual sequestration, that's the long-term accumulation of carbon in woody biomass, peats, and soils. And that is something that occurs on an annual basis. So the annual growth increment of a tree or the annual amount of soil organic matter that accumulates in the soil column. On an annual basis, that sequestration is roughly equivalent to the increase in soil and woody biomass. And it would be, if you could measure this on every forest, it would be exactly equivalent to the amount of carbon dioxide that comes in through photosynthesis and the amount of carbon dioxide that goes out through respiration. We usually don't measure directly the CO2 coming in and out. We rely on an approximate measure of the increase in the woody increment and increase in the amount of organic matter in the soil. So that is an annual value. We can then scale that up to a stock. So if we say all the carbon sequestered by a forest over time, say that forest is 80 years old, the stock of carbon is the sequestration that occurred over that entire 80-year period. So we're integrating sequestration over time to get our standing stock of carbon in the ecosystem. And this little, I really like this little forest succession development clock because I think it helps us think about the way things occur. I'm going to have you ignore the middle ring because that's the understory, which isn't going to be terribly important in our discussion today. But basically what it tells you is about the stock of carbon and the rate of sequestration. So the center band, the green band, is the sequestration rate. And when the clock is at 0, so when a forest is very new, growth is slow, very little carbon's going into the soil. So sequestration is low in the first 10 to 20 years of forest carbon restoration. Then it picks up as the forest hits sort of middle age. And then it begins to slow again once we get past 70 to 80 years, and we hit kind of a much slower rate of sequestration. When you look at the stock, the amount of carbon, total carbon stored in the ecosystem, that continues to increase with the age of the forest. And so I say all this because there's two really important points when looking at forest carbon projects. One is that middle-aged forests are drawing the most carbon out of the atmosphere every year, but old forests contain the most carbon. And those two things come into play a little bit later when we'll talk about different types of carbon sequestration projects. Here, particularly in the MAV, a lot of the restoration that we're doing is bottomland forest. There's a lot of what we consider bottomland hardwood wetland forest. And when you get temporarily or permanently saturated soils, you also have to take into consideration particularly methane. So methane is a greenhouse gas that's also carbon-based, but when we're looking at putting methane on the same level as the carbon in a tree or the CO2 in the atmosphere, methane is 45 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. So even small amounts of methane emitted by a bottomland hardwood forest can alter the way that forest interacts with the climate. So I say that in particular for bottomland hardwood forest restoration, we really have to pay attention to that greenhouse gas balance. And then our carbon sequestered, we have to subtract the methane and nitrous oxide potentially, but subtract the greenhouse gases emitted from carbon sequestration every year. So it starts to get a little bit difficult, but there are quite a few, especially for the MAV, there's been several really robust research reports quantifying these emissions for bottomland hardwood forests. But just to take note that it's really important in saturated environments to consider the emission of methane in particular. So I bet at least the folks from TNC and a couple others have seen this graph. This was a great paper that was done a couple years ago, quantifying the natural climate solution mitigation potential in the United States. And I show this just to show you the couple biggest bars up top there are all to do with forestry. So reforestation, natural forest management, and avoided forest conversion. And that's, I'm going to, again, just give the 10,000-foot overview of these three major types of forestry carbon projects. So we have afforestation, reforestation, improved forest management, and the avoided conversion of forests. So let's talk about afforestation and reforestation. So afforestation would be planting trees where they didn't naturally exist to our human knowledge. And reforestation would be restoring forest canopy where it maybe did exist or has been severely degraded. And the graph I have here, I mentioned there's been some really nice studies on this. The graph I have here is from one of the CEAP studies, the Conservation Effectiveness Assessment Program studies of WRE and CRP in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. It's a really nice study. They not only looked at forest carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but also many other ecological outcomes of CRP and WRP in the MAV. So it's a great report by Murray et al. If you have time to take a look at it, it's freely available from USGS. But afforestation and reforestation, as I said, the establishment of trees. The sort of baseline rules, and I'm sure you'll hear from future speakers that these rules are set by independent bodies and they vary a little bit. But across these rules, the general concept is the land that you reforest has to be pretty severely degraded. It has to have stocking rates generally below 10%. So you can have a couple trees on the site, but to qualify for these type of market mechanisms, you really want to be looking at cleared land. And in the MAV, what's most common is cropland to reforest. There are newer protocols that are set by these independent bodies that are a little bit more flexible. There's a couple protocols now that enable interplanting. So maybe you have higher initial stocking densities, and then you're interplanting things like cottonwoods and other types of enhancements. But in general, this is probably the most straightforward type of carbon program. And the graph you see up here is, again, I told you I would talk a lot about the sequestration rate, that's that little red line at the bottom, and then the stocks that are accumulating over time. And so again, you see that for reforestation project, the sequestration rate, the red line, kind of peaks when the forest is sort of middle-aged, while the stocks continue to increase. And why that becomes really important in our discussion is because the amount of money that the project developer and the landowner, whoever is involved in this project, the amount of money that they're making is going to be completely dependent on the rate at which carbon is sequestered. And so keep this in your mind that your maximum, if you're using this to you're using these kind of protocols to compensate a landowner or to pay for practice, your peak income for that landowner or whoever you are comes 20 to 30 years down the road as that forest matures. So this is one of the types of protocols that it's been a little harder. There are far fewer reforestation projects going on, especially in the United States, because it takes so long to start making money back. And we can talk, and I'm sure there's others in the room that have experience with this, about some ways that we're trying to overcome that really long gap before you start getting paid back for planting the trees. And planting trees isn't cheap in the first place, especially with a lot of site preparation. But that's pretty much where afforestation and reforestation sit. The next type of project, which is far, far more common because of the cost and the return, the speed of getting monetary returns on these projects, is improved forest management. So this is taking I won't call it, it's generally not a completely mature stand, but stand of trees, and in some way improving the management of that stand of trees. So that could include things like in this graph, what we're doing is we're selectively logging to increase the growth rates of surrounding trees, and oftentimes widening the intervals between harvest so that trees are allowed to mature more. There's a ton of different options for improved forest management. Really depends on the baseline scenario. So how a forest is being managed, and then how you're changing that management over time. And so that the definition of an improved forest management project is an increase in the amount of forest carbon over whatever the baseline scenario is. So here often you'll have to define and say, before I implemented this management scenario, I was doing harvest at this interval, or I wasn't doing harvests at all, or I had some sort of pest pressure, or I'm extending rotational lengths. One very common one that we'd probably like to see more of from a wildlife perspective is selective thinning and removing some understory species to reduce competition. But basically, a lot of things can qualify under this, and that improved forest management starts to produce carbon credits that can then be sold and revenue returned to an organization or landowner much quicker. And so you can see this diagram sort of details a bunch of different scenarios. The worst case scenario would be forest that goes all the way to cropland. And by improving forest management, you can sort of make up that delta. There's a bunch of other scenarios that count under this protocol. Yes. I will.
I'm the designated.
All right. I don't know if it will, let me see if I can move this off. There we go. And then finally, avoided conversion. So I'm just curious if anybody has seen over about the last 2 years, there's been some big articles on the front page papers about avoided conversion projects. There's been some real pushback about avoided conversion. And so I just would caution you guys, there's really good avoided conversion projects out there, but because there's been so much attention on these type of projects, the rules surrounding them are getting really stringent. So I just would caution you that if this is a road that you go down or start to get involved in conversations about, know that this is probably the most controversial and quickly changing rules are around avoided conversion projects. Avoided conversion is exactly what it sounds like. It's preventing the conversion of forest to non-forest, agricultural development, et cetera, et cetera. These protocols are restricted to private land. They exclude industrial owners for the most part, although that definition is not always super clear. And that conversion is presented through some sort of restricted covenant. Conservation easement is probably the easiest to talk about, and those need to be either long-term or perpetual conservation easements. There is as I mentioned, there's a high burden of proof that's required to demonstrate that the forest was under active threat of conversion. And that's why, it's very hard to demonstrate absent a landowner with something like an appraisal or an intent to sell to somebody who's going to convert that to ag or cropland. It's hard to prove that avoided conversion is robust at this point. And so that's something that we all have to keep an eye out for in avoided conversion and improved forest management. It also is a little bit difficult to prove. Essentially, you're proving a counterfactual. You're proving that something was going to happen and you stopped it from happening. And I think all of us in this room know from conservation planning, sometimes that's pretty difficult. So the burden of proof is really high. And essentially what this graph shows you is just pay attention to the green line. That's the carbon stocks that are eligible for offsets. And then the red line at the bottom is the baseline carbon stock. So the difference between green and red is forest. And then the red would be if you cleared the forest to an alternative land use. And over time, basically, you credit portions of that total change until you get down to, until the credits are equivalent to the change that would have happened if you cleared the forest. So avoided conversion, again, is one that produces monetary returns faster than something like reforestation, but it has a much higher burden of proof. So I apologize because this is a lot of text on a slide. Hopefully the folks that organize the meeting will be willing to send these slides home with you so you can read them. At DU, I'd have to buy you all pizza for lunch for having text this small on a slide. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the baseline requirements for carbon projects. And these are kind of internationally agreed upon standards of what makes a good carbon project. And this would apply to forest, agriculture, any sort of natural climate solution. So as you guys go down the road thinking about agriculture, a project has to be real. So it has to meet a scientific standard for reducing carbon emissions. We know there's a really great body of literature that says that forests sequester carbon as they grow. So a lot of projects have to meet that standard of being real. For forests, that's a lot easier of a requirement to meet than for other ecosystems that have had less scientific study, wetlands being among those. So the other part of a project being real means it's really going to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Is you also have to be able to prove that you will minimize leakage or account for leakage. And leakage is essentially when, I say I own this 800 acres and I'm going to put an easement on it and do an avoided carbon project. But Georgia Pacific is then just going to cut down the 800 acres right next to me because they're not logging my land. That's a very simple explanation. But you have to be able to prove that by doing a project, you're not just shoving off the outcomes to a different parcel of land. So that's what a project is. It's real. It has to result in a net removal or avoided emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Additional, it means that the project, carbon dioxide would not have been removed from the atmosphere or stored if the project had not been done. So and one of the sort of litmus tests there is, was carbon finance an important part of the project? So I will give you another sort of real world example there for a reforestation project. If Ducks Unlimited got some major donor dollars and gave them to Jacob to reforest his land, and then we said, okay, well, then let's also develop a carbon project on that. That's not truly additional, because someone had already paid, that project was going to happen whether we had carbon revenue or not. Somebody had already paid for the reforestation. An additional project doesn't mean that carbon has to pay the whole bill, but it has to mean that carbon was part of the incentive to do the project, whether that's forest management, reforestation. And this is a rule that is probably one of the most contentious and difficult to decipher. So you will hear a lot of banter about additionality. Everyone has different rules. It is just something that has to be discussed at a project level, especially when you're looking at putting together budgets and justifications for projects. One very clear-cut rule is additionality completely rules out using any source of federal funds that are compensatory. So if you have a compensatory mitigation, say it's a compensatory wetland mitigation project that you're required to do by law, that you are ineligible for carbon projects. There's other sources of federal funds and compensatory state funds that would make a project ineligible. So again, there's no hard and fast rule here other than you have to work with somebody who knows what they're doing to look at how your project is being financed in order to meet that additionality rule. Verifiable, essentially we need to be able to count things, and a third neutral party needs to be able to count those things. So usually we use very widely available models, like for forest carbon, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or other like tools from Forest Service and NRCS to model carbon, and then use surveys like the FIA to go and make measurements. So the kind of measurement tools and models we use are freely available and backed by well quantified science. And a third party could reasonably look at those and say, yep, you counted the carbon correctly. Permanent. I put an asterisk here, and I think that one of my the folks that are following me are going to talk about this a little bit, but it used to be that we really only thought of carbon projects, good carbon projects, as being permanent, meaning the emissions reductions could not be temporary, they had to be perpetual. And the use of a perpetual conservation easement or other type of perpetual agreement was necessary to prove that. In the context of many of these carbon protocols, you're looking at someone's going to be checking on that project. You're married to verifying and measuring that project for 40 to 140 years. So very long, much longer than I care to think about measuring a carbon in a forest. But there are now more recent developments in markets that are allowing for something called ton-year accounting, which is temporary carbon storage that's sort of discounted for the fact that it is temporary. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but just know that that rule of permanence is changing a little bit, but also know that a permanent project gets credited with way more carbon than a temporary ton-year project, because we're looking at the lifespan of the project. Permanence is not always assured. I'm sure everyone knows that there were massive fires in the Western US this year. those fires in Oregon burned, I think, 2 forest carbon offset program projects almost completely. And that's why projects keep what's called a buffer pool. So you're not allowed to sell all of your credits. Say I generate 100 credits on my 800 acres of land. I'm not allowed to market all 800 of those. I have to work with a developer and figure out what the size of my buffer pool, that is credits that I hold in reserve in case something bad happens, like I burn a quarter section of my property. And so that's, when you hear the term buffer pool, that's carbon that we're setting aside either from your own project, or you might buy credits from another project to hold as a buffer pool. And at the very end of your project, you can then sell those if you have proof that everything is above board. But again, some of these are 40 to 140 years of verification and calculations. And then finally, projects have to be enforceable. And essentially what that means is you have to be able to show ownership. So most of these credits on registries are serialized, and then the registry retires them. And that means they can only be claimed one time. And they have to be, you have to be able to trace them back to the owners. And a lot of newer models of big carbon sequestration projects are actually putting those on like the blockchain and serializing them and using all kinds of neat technology to ensure this. But going back to the old like spreadsheet technology when all of this began, every credit essentially has a serial number associated with it. So it has to be enforceable that a carbon credit purchased by a consumer of those credits, you have to be able to trace that back through all the way to where the credit was generated, and sort of prove that it is a real credit and that it hasn't been double counted. Even smaller text, but this is my last slide before we can talk about question and answer. I just wanted to go through all the different roles in a carbon project. So there's a project sponsor or project proponent. And I'm guessing a lot of us in this room are interested probably in this role in carbon project development, where we're working on scoping a forest restoration or other forest project, identifying landowners, and starting to connect the pieces with a forest activity, a group of landowners, and a particular conservation action that we're interested in the outcome of. Carbon project developers, technically anyone can act as a carbon project developer if you're willing to learn how or find collaborators to learn the models, to make the measurements, to do the calculations of buffer pools, etc. But more and more, there are firms that specialize in carbon project development that take on this role. So they are modeling the credits of proposed activities to the baseline, preparing reports for the verifier. They have extensive technical expertise in carbon. In the forestry sector, there's a ton of great project developers. And I highly recommend working with a well-vetted project developer and not trying a DIY approach. Our carbon portfolio, we developed ourselves back in 2010, 2012, and it's way easier. We now work with developers on all our projects. Landowners. So I think as I said, many of these protocols require you to be working on private lands. So inevitably you're working with private landowners. There are economies of scale. Really big tracts of land are going to be fastest to work with, but you can also aggregate a lot of small landowners under some protocols. So you need to work with the landowners. They may already have a conservation easement on top of which you're laying an additional carbon easement, or carbon could be built into your easement template in the first place. Sort of depends on how you're structuring each of these types of proposals. Verifiers. Verifiers are by definition independent third-party contracts. They are in the US, they're accredited by the American National Standards Institute. to act on behalf of registries. So they basically go through all your documentation and not only look at, hey, did you count the carbon correctly? They're also looking for verification. Say you're working with 18 small landowners, they're going to ask you for documentation of the easement for each of those landowners. They will probably ask for maps, remote sensing, receipts, many of the same things that NRCS would request to demonstrate that the project actually occurred on the ground and then that you counted the carbon correctly. Projects generally go through verification periods every 3 to 5 years. So verification is something that's done basically every time that it's financially feasible to issue a new, we call them a new tranche of credits, but a new set of credits. So you do that every 3 to 5 years throughout a project's lifespan. Registries. Registries are the independent bodies, and right now they, in the voluntary market, and California also has a state-based market for natural climate solutions. Each one of those sets their own rules. So they're Verra, you may have heard of Verra, the American Carbon Registry, which is based out of Winrock, the Climate Action Reserve. There are a couple different registries that operate either nationally or globally, and they all are setting their own rules. They work with a big body of scientists and technical experts to develop the rules around particular carbon project rules. And then they also take information from the verifiers and list the credits on the registry where they can be purchased. I think we all know what consulting foresters are, hopefully. In forest carbon projects, your consulting forester is super important for doing your timber cruises, setting your baseline, for improved forest management and restoration, helping with site plans for various management activities and plantings. And then at the very end of this chain are the people who are buying carbon credits. And one of the things that I will, I guess, just sort of personal learning from our journey as well as others that are doing forest carbon projects, there's a lot more flexibility now in not just developing a project and selling a carbon, waiting till the very end to sell a carbon credit. Consumers are now coming in on the front end of projects and doing early project investments in exchange for knowing that they'll get to have those carbon credits as they're generated over the lifetime of the project. So the way in which all of these bodies are interacting to develop a carbon project is very dynamic. And I don't want to say there's no one way in which these things occur. So that's really what I have for a really quick and dirty overview of forest carbon and how it works with markets. So maybe we can have some time for questions, clarification. If anyone wants to go down the rabbit hole on any of these things.
Just to break the silence in the room, thank you for the presentation. I think this is going to be, really does sort of set equal terminology across the room. I know we're going to have a variety of presentations with our different perspectives, different opportunities, different activities around carbon. So I think this is perfect in like where it sits in the agenda and giving people sort of context to what I hope is a robust conversation throughout today. I guess I have a question is, where does DU see itself in this space? Are they a project sponsor working with different registries or partners in, trying to advance their own conservation?
Yeah, so we have actually, so we've oddly been like very out front in the carbon space and then very way back in the carbon space. So we started one of the first avoided conversion projects for grasslands, which is analogous to a forest carbon project, except for it's not trees, it's grass. Back in that project started scoping in 2010, I think. And verified its first credits in 2014. We acted, in that case, we acted as the project developer and worked with all the land, we acted as a developer and the sponsor working to aggregate a bunch of landowners. We actually also worked with the American Carbon Registry, and we were not involved in this. We had a technical panel of experts. We funded a revision of an avoided conversion protocol as well, after recognizing some of the issues. We now have the largest grasslands carbon portfolio in the US, but that's the only major portfolio that we have. We've been looking a lot at forestry, but because, as many of you probably know from working with DU, we're extremely mission focused, and how that fits into our mission has been more difficult. Most of the reforestation work we do is part of WRE, is funded already by NRCS, and we don't think carbon project development on that meets the additionality test. But we're continuing to look at, we're actually undergoing a big exercise right now to understand if there's a role for it, but coming at this from a conservation angle with our landowners, a lot of the things that we do, it just wouldn't be additional to. And so finding a way that carbon can be used. We're particularly interested in reforestation, but as I showed you in that graph, one of the difficulties with reforestation, base reforestation, crop to forest, is you don't get paid back for 30 or 40 years, and I'd be fired by then. So that's kind of where we sit in some of this, is we've been a little circumspect. We have worked with landowners for whom we hold their easements to go through legal paperwork to allow them to layer a carbon project and improve forest management on top of that, but we don't act as a developer in that. So.
I want a second. Oh, so I thought that was fun presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Really important, yeah, piece of shared language. I guess 2 questions for me. One, from where you said it, for you, where do you think the best resources for folks like folks are? Where the best resources for like understanding some better?
I think, yes. Oh, yes. I'm sorry, what's your name? Alex. So Alex was asking about some good places for resources. Starting with some of the registries is a really good place to look at projects that already exist. I hate to say this, DU's website on this is okay. TNC has some great material, as does WWF. So there's conservation organizations out there that have some really good information on this. And then there's a sort of relatively newly formed group called Carbon Plan that is positioned themselves as sort of like they don't do any project development. They're sort of only in the assessment and ranking space for carbon protocols and carbon projects. And they have some great, like very layman's terms explainers for exactly every part of a carbon project, great diagrams, great little like slider tools that you can sort of play around with. And then they also assess not only forest carbon, but also some of the ag carbon protocols and soil carbon storage protocols. So they're a great home base from a fairly neutral perspective to find easily digestible information. And did you have another question, or?
Oh, yeah, I guess my second question is kind of things you're looking forward, excited about the development of forest carbon as a things that make you nervous.
Yeah, the finances make me nervous. I don't think that all of this stuff is gonna go away. I think we are on an upswing. I do want to be very clear that carbon offsetting is a tool in the toolbox, and we can't offset enough carbon to tip the balance on climate change. There's reductions in fossil fuel use that have to, it's just the reality of the situation. So offsets are are one of the many tools in our toolbox to get there. And I think it's a great opportunity for conservation. We can figure out the finance piece of it, which we're starting to. It's such a great opportunity for landowners to get additional compensation, not just the baseline compensation for WRE or CRP project, but to get some lasting income. We have an example from our grasslands portfolio where a cattle operation in Colorado reached out to us, and the difference in the money they're making with their carbon credits from avoided conversion has helped them economically through some really difficult times in the cattle industry, and kept grass and wetlands on the ground, which is what we cared about. So I'm excited for it to be a tool for conservation, and for keeping landowners in conservation land cover. And carbon becomes more of a commodity that can aid conservation. But I think we have a long way to go before we can scale it in a really robust way. Not too long, but
Hey, how are you? I have two questions unrelated, they're both wide open. And thank you for being here. Great presentation on it. The first is, do you have any thoughts, maybe just your thoughts for the group about additionality, particularly when it comes to NGOs like the Nature Conservancy or Conservation Fund? State agencies like I work for with game and fish, this is something I wrestle with a lot. Both mainly around improved forest management. So that's one, just a special one. The other one is, do you have any experience with any international carbon projects, particularly in the forestry realm?
yeah, so we're working on, I'll start with the first one, the second one, because it's easier. We're working with our DU has actually 3 organizations, Canada, US, and Mexico. And we're working with DU de Mexico on some mangrove forestry carbon projects, which are great and actually have an analog to something I know Arkansas Game and Fish is doing. They're all based around, there's no there's no propagation, there's none of that. It's all improving hydrology and then relying on natural regeneration, which makes them super inexpensive for the amount of carbon that's sequestered. In terms of additionality, I will tell you the way that we have formalized our thinking at DU is we have to have the outcome at the end of the day has to be additional habitat acres on the ground. So whether that's additional forested acres or additional improved forested acres for habitat, again, my rules are going to be different than everyone else's rules because we're working priority waterfowl habitat. So that kind of narrows our band of what is additional for us, what we think pushes a conservation mission forward. The other lens through which we've looked at it is additional unrestricted revenue. So in the state agency context, the state of Virginia is a really good example. They've been working with University of Virginia and I believe a TNC property, and the governor has explicitly written into law, has given Virginia DNR permission to use carbon credits derived from the restoration of seagrass beds and then roll that money forward into more restoration and research on those seagrass beds. So that's another way, I think, in which you can think about that additionality lens, but it's really hard to think about. And I think there will be increased scrutiny on projects around additionality. So it's, I don't know, I don't have a great answer other than to tell you the way that we think about it, which is if we can't justify that carbon dollars went to more acres than we would have done without the carbon dollars, it's hard for us to justify that as being additional under what's important in our conservation framework.
Right, thank you.